Professor Ostrich is our speaker today, and was it how many, 25 years now? 28, and he is now retired from Nova. He taught here at this school for 28 years in the history department, and he taught the usual courses in Western civilization and history of the U.S., but he also taught a one-year course on Russian history, which was, really good. But, so anyway, he's a retired history professor from Nova, and he looks forward to these meetings. And today he's going to speak on a subject about the causes of the Civil War.
About how the Civil War and why it occurred, how it occurred, why it occurred, and perhaps even more, to me, devilish to really answer, was it necessary? And two, could it have been avoided? And very simply put, all of the above. Because perhaps there's no absolute, nor ever will there be any absolute, definitive, historical, absolute reason without question. Because it involved so many other factors. And generally speaking, if one were to ask people generally on the street, why did the Civil War happen? It happened because of slavery. Well, yes it did, but then it didn't. Typically what the historians say. Yes and no. The immediate cause of the Civil War was far different than the long range. And when emancipation came, it only came because Lincoln felt it would keep Great Britain out of the war, helping the secessionist South. And many of you sitting here wondering, what has Great Britain got to do with it? And there are those who would argue that had Great Britain going to war on the southern side, probably the French would have also. And the reason for that, we'll tell you. Then perhaps, of all things that happened during the Civil War, the Russian Tsarist regime of Alexander II sent a Russian fleet to visit the Atlantic coast and a Russian fleet in the Pacific coast, all to show the Northerners of the Union that if those great powers would go to war against the Union, Russia would come in on the Union side. And so the Civil War has an interesting facet that very few people ever knew about or talk about. Well, you'll hear it here. And you may be the first, including some of the students who I've had here at Nova, where I was privileged to teach, as Albert mentioned, for 28 years. A few of them might remember that. But in order to set the stage for the Civil War, which was one of the greatest catastrophes this nation ever experienced. And there are a few, of course, the Great Depression of 1929, and World War II, the Korean War, and a whole series of wars in our time, and perhaps the catastrophe of 9/11, hopefully. Those will be the last, but I'm sure they won't be, and we can only hope otherwise. Now, in order to get, how to get started, the first slaves appeared to the colonies in 1619, roughly 25 slaves. And by 1860, you can do the arithmetic, how many years is that, but by 1860, there were over 4 million slaves in the South, comprising actually almost half, not quite half of the population of the slave states. Now, one can argue what was the long-term reason The long-term reason for the Civil War was very simple. It was neglected. It was there. It was analogous to a cancer in the body or another infectious disease or whatever. That you neglected and people pretend it just isn't there. But it would pop up every now and then to remind us that this nation has a whole slave population. Roughly, the North, by 1860, the North had over 20 million population, of which was no slaves, and the South, roughly half of the population, or double, roughly 9 million Southerners enslaved. So, without question, the nation was overwhelmingly free, or free state. It was neglected until even though the South slowly but surely invested in the slave economy. One thing to bear in mind, irrespective of the humanity or inhumanity of slavery, one thing to remember, it paid to have slaves. It paid for the North, it paid for the South, because in the economy of that the slaves were able to furnish, for the purchaser of the goods that slaves furnished, it was a money maker. Why? Because there was no labor cost in slavery. So you didn't have to bear the overhead of costs, which and labor, and so on and so forth. That's it. Nothing about race, nothing about anything else, not even humanity. And sad to say, one of the states of the Union eventually that would become was one of, we consider today a very liberal free state always. But the great slave ships that came in stopped off at Providence, Rhode Island. And you see a Rhode Islander and you tell him that you guys sent a lot of slaves south. And he'll look at you and say, that can't be. And the truth is, it was. Newport and some of the ports on the Rhode Island coast were the chief stopping point for the slave trade coming over in Africa, and the people marketing slaves would send them to the various buyers southward. So it wasn't until actually the 1790s, after the Declaration of Independence, when all of the northern states ended slavery forever. Well, that's good for them, but up until the 1790s, slavery was still to be found in northern states, etc. So enough of that part of the brief history there. Slavery was ignored until it reached or raised its ugly head, and that is in the Constitutional Convention of 1787-1780, when the Constitution was written. There it became manifest, obvious to all that slavery would be a problem. And the problem was easily recognizable. The northern states, by and large, for the most part, were against slavery. Therefore, when the argument before the fathers of the Constitution at that Constitutional Convention of 1787-88 were trying to figure out how shall the states be represented, the big states, the little states, the unpopular, wherever, whatever. And the whole point is, how would the slaves be counted? Well, the northerners, or one could say the extreme end of the northern graph or whatever, would say no slave should be represented as counting for that state's seats in the House of Representatives. The southern states said, no, slaves have to be counted because they are from our states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. The North answered by saying, since you don't grant these slaves citizens, they were not citizens of the United States, therefore they cannot be counted. Well, the southern states, and not surprisingly, South Carolina burst in, so to speak, to defend slavery. And South Carolina said, well, if we can't count the slaves, we are not going to approve of the Constitution, therefore there will be no Constitution, and perhaps no United States as we know it. So as early as 1787, the threat of Southern secession over slavery always hung high like the sword of Damocles. Then they came to a bargain. And this is one of the wonderful things of the Constitution itself, that generally speaking, it was one of the world's great political pieces of work, and so they decided on a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. Therefore, the North would say 0 representation, the South said full representative, and they did what Solomon would have done, is taken his sword and cut the baby in half. I'm sure some of you who went to Sunday school remember that story. And so basically they had a Solomon decision made. And that is every slave will count as 3/5 of a human being. Wow, isn't that wonderful? But it settled it, and South Carolina said, okay, we couldn't get anything better. Perhaps that argument, as specious as it may seem, and inhuman as it may seem, was the only kind of compromise could be made at that point. Later on, we'll find out another great compromise failed, and that's what brought on the Civil War. Going from there, what made slavery possible, not possible, I'll use a better word, economical. Yeah, I can't use a word like that, economical. Because without the economic factor involved, perhaps there would have been no slavery. And from the other side, if slavery was not ended by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War, perhaps it would have died on its own, because as the Industrial Revolution was sweeping Western economics, both in Europe and in Japan and in the United States, slavery might not have existed under an industrial economic force, and that's probably so. So maybe 600,000 lives would have been saved, and that's about what the life cost was, 600,000 of the Civil War, half on the Confederacy and half for the Union. Lots and lots of lives to be lost. The first real economic value of the slaves in particular was in the indigo trade, which furnished the beautiful purplish, bluish dyes for clothing and so on. The second part was on the rice culture. Both rice culture and indigo culture, picking, is the sort of thing that reminded me, of course, when I was in Southeast Asia. The people bent over all day long pulling out things out of the swamps, water, whatever, for rice or whatever grew there. And that's what the slaves were doing. So South Carolina, particularly, and some of the other southern states, lived on the indigo dye plant and on rice. That would not have been enough, and so slavery would have died then and there, because indigo dye no longer needed plants. It could be made, and the Germans invented the dye much better than even the plants had. So that could have been the end of slavery. However, in the 1790s, a little invention by a guy named Eli Whitney, and he may still be cursed in hell for that. Yet, he is the one with the invention of the cotton gin. What made the cotton gin an invention, as it did, is that it saved a lot of the labor by the slaves, but more importantly, it increased production incredibly. That one little cotton gin would save hours and hours of picking seeds out of a bowl of cotton. That would take all day long. The little cotton gin with a crank, you could, and a set of combs, you could comb it out. And so immediately it was one of those great successes of American ingenuity as such. And it made slavery now very important in cotton production. And that also for the North, because cities in the Boston area, Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, the great textile factories up there in the North, now began buying cotton from the South and so on and so forth. So everybody made money off of slave labor. Was there a racial context to this? Not in the sense of the economics, because if you could get Caucasians, Chinese, any other race, as long as they made a buck for you, we're going to hire them. I mean, that's the way capitalism was. Maybe Mr. Sanders, who's running far to the left of everybody, would have said that was an evil sin. But I understand that, well, without going into it, that perhaps so, perhaps not. The racial factor comes in later. It was rather subtext. Anybody could be a slave. The Hebrews had slaves. The Egyptians had slaves. Everybody got a slave. Why? Because that's how we are wired in our brain. And I've come to the conclusion, one of the recommendations I've made, how you can prevent this for the future, every third or fourth child that's born should be given a prefrontal lobotomy. Oh. And that would eliminate lots of emotions and lots of stuff like that. And there would be 1/3 of the population running around smiling. Well, we got them in Colorado already on and that jelly old state of Washington up there, yeah. They'll go on the way anyhow without a prefrontal lobotomy necessary and all that. So here we have slavery already there as a fact of life. It doesn't pop into focus for a little while. Now, what one has to understand here, ladies and gentlemen, is this very clearly. What matters in these United States is the representation, well, for political purposes, the representation in Congress. As long as the southern states, who now by the 1820s began investing an enormous amount of energy, money, sources, and so forth, and in the southern stock market in Richmond or wherever they had, is that slavery must exist for the South to continue, because the Southerners were not investing in iron and steel and factories and rail. It would cost them dearly in the Civil War. One of the reasons for losing the Civil War is that the South made bad investments. Another argument, but know that. And so consequently, by 1820 is how the balance was maintained between slave state and free state. And as each free state came into the Union, there would be a slave state. Why? Because as all of you learned in your history class back in the 8th grade somewhere, every state in the Union has how many senators?
Two.
How many?
Two.
Two. Two. Okay. And representatives according to the population. So we got that straight. So if you're doing the calculus like then and there in political science, you know, as a Southerner, as long as I have an equal number of states on my side, we can block everything there or vice versa. Sort of what we hear today. The Democrats blocking everything the Republicans and the Republicans blocking everything of the Democrats. And we have deadlock, but that's a democratic way. Democratic with a small d, not a capital one. Okay. Now, having said all that, so around 1820, the state of Missouri reached a quota, or at that point, where it could petition the Congress to come in as a slave state. Well, the fewer among the Northerners, irrespective of Democrat, Republican, because at this time there was only one political party, and that's the Democratic Party. There was no Republican Party at that point. And so the nation was divided between sectionalism, where your state was, and whether it was free or slave. So they looked around on a map, and where could we find another state to balance Missouri coming in as a slave state? Anybody know where?
Kansas.
They looked at Massachusetts and found out, of all things, Massachusetts had a little colony of its own. And that little colony was up north called Maine.
Oh.
And the folks up at Maine hated the Massachusetts people. They referred to them as snobbish and, you know, whatever. And there's something to be said about Boston, Massachusetts. Okay. Now, having said that, and a brilliant, one of our most brilliant political figures in American history, and I just love the guy. Well, I hate, but I love this guy, and that was Henry Clay. Of all of the Americans, I believe, and since I'm the guy talking, I can say what I want. I think Henry Clay should have been president. Henry Clay, perhaps, was the only person that might have prevented the Civil War. As it was said of Henry Clay, he was a great compromiser. He could send the devil to heaven as an angel and bring a lot of angels to hell on a compromise. And he was the guy doing it. He was incredible. He was the great compromiser. So Henry Clay came up with a compromise of 1820. The first real, after the 3/5 slave issue of the Constitutional Convention, the compromise of 1820 had an incredible effect. One, it maintained the balance of free and slave. One free state, one slave. Michigan would come in, and then Arkansas would come in, Mississippi would come in, then Illinois would come in, and so forth and so forth. And you can look at your textbooks, and you can see the back and forth. But as long as the balance, the Southerners or slaveholders could not worry, because their institution would be safe. It would be safe from any attempt on the part of the North to abolish slavery, because they could cancel. They had their own, with that senator from Nevada that kept everything from going to the Senate, Harry Reid or something. They had their own Harry Reid sort of guy to maintain a blockage that nothing would come before the Congress to attempt to avoid slavery. Having said that, they passed the Compromise of 1820 with another proviso, and this is the critical thing, critical factor, that the division line between North and South could be standardized. And that is, for you folks, if you have an atlas at home, a map of the United States, and you can start with North Carolina right above Nags Head, North Carolina, you will find the 36th latitude and 30 minutes, 36:30. Now remember that, students, it's going to be on your exam. And would you believe half of the class didn't get it? Oh, well, I didn't know. Well, I told you. Well, I didn't believe you. You should be glad you're not teaching school today. Better yet, you're not teaching in college. So 36:30 became the dividing line. And it's interesting when you look at that dividing line and run it across from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific coast. Now, half of the Pacific coast was not in American hands anyhow. It was in Spanish hands. No, not today, then. It was part of the Spanish Empire. But somehow Americans far see, figured one day we're going to take it from Mexico. Well, Mexicans are now getting even. Footnote here. Okay. Historians can footnote anything in that one. And then you take that 36:30 line, and you start with North Carolina, it represents the Virginia-North Carolina border. You go further west, it represents the Kentucky-Tennessee border. You go further west, it represents the Arkansas-Missouri. Now you're going into foreign territory, into Spanish and now Mexico, on the verge of the Mexican independence of 1821. All right, but you go to the Pacific coast, and if you look at 36:30, it's somewhere south of Monterey, which means that to be formed California at some future date, if there ever was a California, but there was a Mexican province of California, mainly of Catholic stations all up and down the main highway, what is, I think in California today, Highway 101 or something like that, the main north-south highway. Anyhow, somewhere south of Monterey, 36:30 would come, and that territory, of course, according to the Missouri Compromise, half of it would be southern, the other half north. In that settlement of 1820, the Southerners were deliriously happy as a Democrat in Mississippi or something like that, or wherever Democrats are down south or whatever. And the point being is that they were ensured by law that their empire of sorts was already formed, already recognized, and the boundary was 36:30, with the exception of Missouri, which is north of 36:30. But from that on, as they saw it forever and forever, this was all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which will one day be ours. Well, needless to say, that worked for a while. The problem of Texas came before everybody, and Texas, being what Texas turned, they decided they didn't like to be Mexicans, they wanted to be Texans, but the reason they joined Mexico is to get free land and so on. They refused to do it. Well, they got the Mexicans calling those folks a bunch of liars and whatever. They didn't do what they were supposed to do to be good Mexican citizens and so on. It's hard to get a Southern Baptist converting to Catholicism, particularly Spanish Catholicism. That was part of the problem. Well, we didn't go into that, but Texas became a problem. And so what to do about Texas? Well, what the Texans do is they declare themselves independent and a sovereign nation, the Republic of Texas. So you had Texas for 10 years, a sovereign state. And there's some very cute stories about that, very few people know about, when the minister sent by Texas to the British court and whoever the Texas representative, sort of kind of a guy, is like who is the movie actor, kind of a leaning, tall, leaning guy, and he meets the Queen Victoria, young lady. Hi, ma'am, I'm from Texas. And she says to him, presumably, my, where's Texas? Well, her foreign minister, Mr. Melbourne, she had a big map and throws the map on the table. She sees a big blob there. Said, that's Texas, ma'am. And she said, my, is that big, isn't it? He said, sure is, ma'am. Well, I'm doing the theatrics here, but I can guess it's something like that. All right, so Texas eventually would come into the Union. Now, why do I bring up Texas? Because part of the independence of Texas was guaranteed and recognized by Mexico with the proviso the United States would never, ever annex Texas, or Mexico would go to war with the United States. Well, we had a far-seeing president who was perhaps one of the worst presidents we ever had, and believe me, there were several of them, John Tyler. And Congress refused to pass a law admitting Texas. Why? Because the North feared if Texas were brought in, 5 or 6 or 7 states would be carved out of Texas and made separate states. And so, no, Texas cannot come into union. Well, it seems like, where I heard this story before, President Tyler signed an executive decree bypassing the Congress, admitting Texas into the Union. Have we heard of that before? My goodness, it sounds like today's paper, another executive order. Everybody must drink milk, not in cartons anymore, but in pails, or whatever the executive decree you want. Okay, now if I sound a bit on the harsh side, so be it. However, the war with Mexico broke out, and we won a war for once, and we did. We beat the Mexicans. And what happened? And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now I know that's tough to spell, so you see your next Hispanic friend ask them, how do you pronounce Hidalgo? And they, whatever. But here is important, that in that annexation, or in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, boy, did we take a slice out of the Mexican Empire. And in that, we got what would eventually come to Texas, a little slice of Nevada, all of Arizona, all of New Mexico, a little slice of Colorado and Utah, and perhaps some other Texas territory further up north into Utah. And so we gained the entire Southwest. People ask the question, and I would ask you, what president is responsible for all of that territory coming to the United States? Anybody know? Who? Pope. Pope. Good for you. He gets the A. Okay. Thank you. J.K. Pope, John. And one of the most forgotten presidents we ever had. A great president. He belongs among the 6 or 7, as far as I'm concerned, best presidents we ever had. And to boot, he signs a treaty with Great Britain. The Northwest Territory comes to the United States, which includes Washington and Oregon, and they get to keep, the British get to keep Vancouver Island and British Columbia there. And so the boundary is now going all the way from the Great Lakes all the way to Puget Sound. The complete rounding out. So the question now happened, what about California? Well, I must say this. The Southerners thought they, in the 1820 compromise, remember that, 30 years earlier, boy, did they get in, as they saw it, did they get an empire? Boy, look where we're going to get. we're going to get Arizona, New Mexico, what would be Nevada, a little bit of Nevada, and a good part of California. And they're all going to be slave states. There was a little problem of geography. Have any of you ever been to Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada? Do you think you would have slaves there picking cotton?
No.
Well, it seems that the Southerners didn't know that. They didn't also count on one other thing. And you remember Bobby Burns and his great poem, The Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men are bound to get screwed up. All words to that. And for literature teachers here, pardon me, please, but Bobby Burns got it right. I mean, they got screwed up because they didn't understand something else. That when the 1820 compromise was made, the population of all of California was about 20,000 at most. White settlers, most of the Indian tribes all up and down, and there were the Padres with their particular places of worship and schools and whatever they had. But only about 20, at most 20,000 scattered around. Well, within a year after 1848, a horrendous event occurred, horrendous for the South. The whole demographics of California changed overnight. What happened? The gold rush, absolutely the gold rush. No one ever counted on that little farm up there north of Sacramento, Mr. Sutter's. Hundreds and thousands of people swarmed into California, mostly from the north, mostly from Europe. Do these people want slaves? No way. No Southerner hardly showed up on the gold rush. Why should they? They're making their money on cotton. They're not going to stay there all day long in the hot sun and pan for gold. So the Southerners have not a piece of California. And so when the vote came in California, they essentially said, hell no, we ain't going to divide. We are one sovereign state, the great bear republic, just like Texas. So Texas also, by the way, footnote, decided it wasn't going to allow itself to divide up. California said the same. Boy, the Southerners really knew now that they bought a pig in a poke. What that did for the South, it outraged them because like any loser, they're not going to blame themselves, but we're going to blame the other people. They lied to us. That's like buying a car from a used car dealer, wearing a striped shirt and checkerboard jackets and pink trousers. Would you buy a car from him and say a little old lady from Nova drove this car? No. So you blame everybody but yourself. Now that's important, with the psychological sense that the South knew now they were on the defensive and that they made a very, very poor investment. Very poor. You know, the geography, as I've enumerated here. It looked like all hell was going to break loose in Congress. And who shows up but my friend Henry Clay. And Henry Clay's got a great idea. He knows that things are going bad in the Republic. Already the issue of slavery and the contest, and already the sparks of disunion in the Union were coming about. Having said that, in the election of 1848, they elect a war hero, and one thing is true in American politics. When you're in trouble, you elect a war hero for president. And so they elected old Zachary Taylor. And Zach Taylor was a nice guy. He was from the South, but he was for the Union. And being for the Union said, because he was military and he didn't care about politics. But he ups and dies 2 years after. And he was a Whig. which means another Whig in those days, became president. And this is the president that most of America wants to forget because they know nothing about him. And how many of you know of the great glorious mind and times of Millard Fillmore?
Nope.
When I was in graduate school in Pittsburgh, we declared Millard Fillmore's birthday a holiday.
Oh.
And no classes that day, and free beer at the local bar in Pittsburgh, I was at the University of Pittsburgh. And all the bars would have free beer. But this was going to be the great moment of Millard Fillmore. It never happened. So Millard Fillmore becomes president. Well, you're going to now know what he did. Henry Clay got a hold of Millard Fillmore, the new president, and worked out a deal. And that would be the compromise of 1850. Write that down, 1850. Okay. And in that compromise, at that same time, Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, one of the great political figures, said that one of the most glorious speeches ever heard in the Senate. The Union now and forever, it must be preserved, never to be dissolved. And this is 10 years before the Civil War. And I might add, one of the great tragedies that very few people think about. In that year, 3 of the great political figures, 2 of them we keep alive, and that was Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and of all things, the guy from the South, John Calhoun. And Calhoun, but at least Calhoun might have been someone that a person like Clay could have talked to and worked out a deal. So all 3 died within a year and a half of each other. 1851. It was a horrible crash. Well, it was like an airplane crash. With great figures, innocent people and so on. And so that ended the great leadership. And the leadership of the nation was left to some first-rate folks as presidents. But Fillmore listened to Clay. And Clay says, here's what we'll do, Mr. President. We will have five parts of this great, what is called in the Congress, an omnibus bill, in which you bunch together several different, all in one big package. The first, there will be no winners and no losers. California will come in as a free state. The South didn't like that, obviously, but there's nothing more they can do about it. However, it will become a federal law of the fugitive slave law. No slaves escaping the southern slave states going north, all have to be returned. All have to be returned. Immediately, all of the north became what is very common today, what we would call today sanctuary states. And if the good folks of San Francisco and their nutty behavior, and I'm saying that, love San Francisco, but some of them pretty wacko, and I'm saying that, decided that everybody in San Francisco, nobody goes to Yale, almost. Not quite, but no. And so the North was doing the same at that time. So this business of sanctuary cities and sanctuary places is long a matter of history in America. And I guess it's okay to have it. So they decided not to obey the law. And they got away with it. Except for the South, they were outraged. Well, the other 2 parts, Texas got their debt paid for as a Republican, so Texas got something. The District of Columbia, like Solomon, got chopped in half. And one half said that no new slaves, there will be no slave markets in the District of Columbia, but slavery can exist. Now, isn't that a great deal? And the last of all was New Mexico, Arizona, and the rest of that will decide at a future date which way they want to go, slave or free. The South got, as they saw it, got chipped again. You just can't trust those Northerners, they are liars. They lied, they cheated, they stole. And now, understand when you now ask the question, why did the Civil War happen? By now, the psychological fix was already set in for the South. To add insult to injustice, adding insult to all of this as far as the South was concerned, that little old lady who lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, decides to write a book, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And what book does she write? Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the master, slave owner, Simon Legree, has a little daughter. And the little daughter was out on the ice, crossing the ice. She shouldn't have been there, but there she was. And the ice cracked and she was going to drown and die. And the slave dived into the water and saved her. Well, this is right out of Hollywood. Every tear you could imagine got rinsed out of that one. Now, what that did, it completely made the slave into a human being. Made it almost into a Christ-like character in the churches. He is like Jesus, giving up his life for salvation, all that kind of stuff. For the South, this was an outrage. They forbid it to be sold. Forget about the First Amendment to the Constitution. They weren't going to, and if a postman was walking his route to deliver that book or whatever, he would be lucky to get out alive. So for the South, they felt outraged. They now make the slave into a human being, and et cetera, was more than they could take. I might add, as a historian, very rarely does a book of any sort, except a book that I'm going to write, change the face of history. And that is this. It changed the public opinion very quickly. Only once before Tom Paine wrote, when he wrote Common Sense, he said to the Second Continental Congress debating, either do something or get off the pot. Either you declare independence immediately or don't even attempt it. And that inspired lots of folks, including Thomas Jefferson, to declare, to get our independence. Tom Paine's Common Sense. So these two books, Tom Paine at one end, at the other end, Harriet Beecher Stowe. So put that down. But that had an enormous impact. But the cruelest of all to happen to the South. The Southerners decided that they wanted to build already the big thing before the Congress and before, like the pipeline is today, was before or against it. But the South wanted to build a transcontinental railroad to go from New Orleans to San Diego, which at that time was a bustling little town. Now that it was part of the United States. Then there was a very active politician by the name of Stephen Douglas, who was able to have the big debate with Lincoln a few years later. And Stephen Douglas was a sort of a guy, 5'2", so, nothing wrong, big 5'2", but he was called the Little Giant, who imagined himself sort of an early day, I guess, Thomas Trump of sorts, that he knew everything, he could do anything possible now that Henry Clay was gone, and he was going to replace Henry Clay or Daniel Webster or even John Calhoun, because he was going to be president and he's going to win Southern votes. So he had decided or figured out a gambit. He's going to tell the Southerners, look, there are two pieces of real estate up here, up for grabs, and that is Kansas and Nebraska. I will turn, fix, and maneuver that Kansas and Nebraska will come into the Union as slave states. Wow. That's a gift from the gods, manna from heaven. Wow. All you have to do is give me my railroad, and we want to build a railroad. I come from a small little town up there, probably never heard of it, a little place called Chicago. And that little town, we could start the railroad because that's a terminal of the whatever railroad going east, from east to west at Chicago, because bridges across the Mississippi hadn't been built yet. So anyhow, you give me my railroad, and I'm going to make it big in Illinois, in this little town of Chicago, and you will get Kansas and Nebraska. The president at that time is perhaps the most, I guess, the most forgettable president, even more than Millard Fillmore, that less people know about him. And who knows here about all of the great works of Franklin Pierce? Do I hear anyone there? Well, Franklin Pierce is probably the most unknown president we ever had. Except that he was posed south, coming from New Hampshire, and I'll answer that question, why? Okay, we'll let that go for a minute. And he was posed south, and he more or less favored, in order to come into the Union, Kansas would have to create a constitution, and the president would have to sign off on it. And so the Southerners grabbed a town near a place called Lawrence, Kansas, so if you know where that neighborhood is. And so anyhow, they wrote a constitution declaring Kansas to be a slave state. Well, the Southerners were furious. They were furious with Franklin Pierce. They were furious with their own guy from New Hampshire allowing the South to get away with it. So Northerners moved into Kansas by the thousands. And once again, what happened to the South? Got chipped by demographics. Got chipped again. And it broke out into a civil war in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas. And right along with that came a rather extremist radical, as we would call him today, a terrorist named John Brown, in a little town called Potawatomi. How about that, folks? Potawatomi. Potawatomi Creek. And 5 or 6 Southerners were murdered by John Brown and his son. And we'll hear about John Brown in a few moments. And the Southerners, again, were outraged. Outraged. They couldn't get Kansas. 5 Southerners were murdered by Northerners, and boy, the fat is in the fire already. This is 1856, 4 more years to go. Franklin Pierce is notable for one other thing, not where anybody would ever think. He was responsible for a great war or a great event that would happen that would change the history of the world to some degree. Anybody know what Franklin Pierce did? Well, Franklin Pierce, being a good politician, figures out when you are in trouble, the first thing you do is get into a foreign adventure. Get into a foreign adventure, everybody's mind is off of that and on to that. And so he decided now's the time to open up Japan to America. 88 years later, the Japanese thanked us at Pearl Harbor. Now, cause and effect. Well, it's a bit of a stretch, but I had to get Franklin Pierce in there for something. And so there you have that. A year later, a doctor from the area of St. Louis decided to take his slave to visit friends, relatives, who cared, in Illinois. So he takes the slave state, the slave into a free state. And as history, religion, and lots of things thrown into the kettle here would have it, in the ancient Hebrew, in the Old Testament among the Hebrews, that once a slave who is freed can never go back to slavery.